And so when you say the layer twos just get cheaper and cheaper, are they also getting faster at the same time? Are those hand in hand?
Define faster.
Faster execution times.
Well, no, so and from a user's point of view, like users, once again, they don't really have to notice anything. The only thing users have to do is they just have to move their activity from layer 1 to layer 2 at the point when they're comfortable with it, right? And then once they've moved everything to layer 2, then all that they see is that layer 2 just keeps on getting cheaper, and then it gets cheaper again, and then it gets cheaper again. So that's the surge.
And so when you say the layer twos just get cheaper and cheaper, are they also getting faster at the same time? Are those hand in hand?
Define faster.
Faster execution times.
Well, no, so the word faster, like I think there's two kinds of fast, right? There's like latency and there's bandwidth. So latency is like how many seconds do you have to wait for even one transaction to confirm, and then bandwidth is like how many transactions per second. So none of what's happening in the surge improves latency. So far all of this, like, you still have your 12-second slot times. The slot times might even have to increase a bit to handle sharding, so it might have to go up from like 12 to 16. But what's going to go up a lot is bandwidth, right? So like the Ethereum blockchain today can handle 15 to 40 transactions a second. Rollups today, if they add proper compression, can go up to 1,500 to 4,000 transactions a second, and then rollups with sharding can go up to 100,000 transactions a second. The reason why they get cheaper is basically supply and demand, right? If the chain can handle more transactions, then that means that there's more space and you don't have like all of these users that are competing for the same very small number of slots. And so the transaction fees that every single user has to pay just go down by a huge amount. Like that's basically where the cheaper comes from. So it's cheaper because it's a higher bandwidth.
By the way, this bandwidth thing, I think a brilliant site to see this is ETH TPS. I don't know if you've seen this before, Vitalik, but
I have, yeah.
It kind of showcases the bandwidth of Ethereum when you take into account this is Polygon, but also all of the other optimistic rollups and in rollup chains as well. And so Ethereum currently does 65 transactions per second if you add all of that together. And in this block, it's 87 transactions per second. And what you're saying is basically that number will go up and up and up and up for higher and higher and higher with the surge.
Exactly.
And what would this mean for anyone who is still living a life on the layer 1 with the expansion of the number of shards and also the size of shards? Does that mean L1 gas fees are going to come down, or what's the deal with that?
I mean, in the short term, maybe, but I think realistically in the long term, using L1 is just going to keep getting more and more expensive. So you as a user, I think you do need to be prepared for the fact that Ethereum already is transitioning away from being a layer 1 centric ecosystem toward being a layer 2 centric ecosystem. Today, the gains that you can make from switching to layer 2 are maybe only 5x, but in the future there'll be 10x, and then there'll be 50x, and then there'll be 1000x. So eventually all activity is going to have to transition to being layer 2. Eventually, even bridging from one layer 2 to another layer 2 is something that will mostly have to happen without layer 1s. And this is a change that users will have to get used to. I think it's a change that some users are starting to get used to already. But if they can do it, then everything other than that is going to be fairly under the hood for them.
With regards to the shard size and shard count, I want to unpack this one a little bit because we have a couple phases inside of the surge where first we add in sharding in the first place and just a few shards, and then we add more shards. But from what I've gathered from other people's writings, Polynias and some other ETH client devs, is that long term, there actually could be no cap on both the size and the number of shards, so long as the resources that Ethereum has to its availability is sufficient. Is that true? And so then a couple of questions to follow up on that. How will we know when we're ready to add more shards? And is there an ultimate final number of we are going for this many shards with this size? Or is this a number that's always going to be dynamic in Ethereum's future?
So I actually wrote an article about this 6 months ago. And if you go to the post called The Limits to Blockchain Scalability, I think. So sharding gets around a lot of the limits to scalability of non-sharded blockchains that I talk about above. So the first limit I mentioned is quadratic sharding, right? Which basically is this idea that like it's the beacon chain is going to contain headers of shard blocks, and then so you have the beacon chain block, and then you have shard blocks. You only have 2 levels. It's theoretically possible to make blockchain designs that have 3 levels or 5 block levels or a dynamic number of levels. And like I remember the Ton network, for example, like they were trying to do exponential sharding, and like they had this dream of going up to 2 to the power of 92 shards eventually. And my opinion is that stuff is possible in theory, but in practice, going beyond 2 levels is just like too hard and it adds too much complexity, and so it's not worth it. So Ethereum is staying with quadratic. But there's other reasons why scalability going too high becomes too risky. And like, there we go. So what are these risks? Excellent. So keep going down. So basically what I talk about here is that as the data capacity of the chain increases, you get this property that because no single user is going to be downloading or processing the entire chain, you get a minimum number of users that you're counting on to ensure that the chain continues to be secure, right? So like, I guess one analogy of this is that if you imagine like a blockchain as one city, and you imagine you start off with a blockchain that's just a small town. How small is the town? The town is so small that if you make one guard tower and you make the guard tower tall enough, then you can have one security guard, and the one security guard can watch the entire border of the town and make sure that no attackers get in, right? So that's like an unscalable blockchain. Now imagine you start scaling the town up more and more. Eventually you get to the point where like you can't have one guard tower in the center, you have to switch to having guards on the walls, and you need multiple guards on the walls. Well, once you get to a town that's like, let's say, I don't know, like has 100,000 people, then, you might have a wall, your wall might be 10 kilometers long, and like you might need, let's say, 50 guards, right? If you have less than 50 guards, then the guards can't see far enough, and so an attacker might slip through in between 2 of the guards. If the city expands further, and then the city is, like, say, as big as Manhattan, then you're gonna need like 1,000 guards, right? And, if you don't have your 1,000 guards, then, like an attacker might slip through in between 2 of the guards, and like the security of the town might break. So the bigger the town gets, you start committing to an assumption about how many security guards are you sure that you can that you're always going to have. Fine today, but it might not be fine tomorrow. And if it's not, and just in case it's not fine tomorrow, then you might want to actually have some kind of alternative. But in order to have that kind of world, blockchains have to actually be decentralized. Blockchains have to actually be credibly neutral, and blockchains have to actually scale, right? So that the blockchain can actually provide those benefits in practice and not just in theory.